Ancient Hermetic teachers believed most human beings live trapped inside invisible mental prisons, never realizing their thoughts are quietly shaping every event, relationship, fear, and opportunity around them. In this forbidden journey through the Kybalion, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, and the ancient laws hidden inside Hermetic philosophy, you'll discover why reality mirrors vibration, how emotional states silently control outcomes, and why mastering your inner frequency was once considered sacred knowledge reserved only for initiates. For the next few moments, observe your thoughts carefully, not the loud ones, the repetitive ones, the hidden assumptions you repeat every day without noticing. Because according to Hermetic wisdom, those thoughts may already be building your future. Chapter 1. The universe is mental. What if the world you experience is not reality itself, but a projection filtered through consciousness? That question sat at the center of one of the most influential Hermetic teachings ever written, the Kybalion. Hidden behind cryptic language and symbolic philosophy was a principle that ancient initiates considered dangerously powerful. The all is mind, 3 simple words, yet generations of mystics, philosophers, and seekers believed those words described the deepest structure of existence itself. The teaching did not mean the physical world was imaginary. It meant human beings never encounter reality directly. They encounter their interpretation of it. 2 people can stand beneath the same storm cloud, and one sees catastrophe while another sees renewal. One experiences humiliation where another experiences instruction. One collapses under pressure while another becomes disciplined by it. The event remains the same. Consciousness changes the experience. That is why Hermetic teachers obsessed over mental discipline. Thousands of years ago, deep within Egyptian mystery schools, initiates were trained to observe thought before reacting to it. Ancient temple traditions describe the undisciplined mind as a wild horse dragging the soul through chaos. Students were not immediately trusted with sacred teachings. First, they were taught silence, observation, emotional restraint, and concentrated attention, because according to Hermetic philosophy, a distracted mind creates a fragmented reality. The ancient priests understood something modern life constantly encourages people to forget. Repeated thought becomes internal atmosphere, and internal atmosphere slowly shapes behavior, perception, and decision-making, quickly, invisibly, relentlessly. A fearful mind notices threats everywhere. An angry mind interprets neutral events as attacks. A defeated mind unconsciously searches for proof of limitation. Over time, the mind stops observing reality objectively and begins reinforcing its own assumptions. That is the hidden prison. Plato echoed this idea centuries later through his famous allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained inside darkness mistook shadows for reality because shadows were all they had ever known. The Hermetic initiates would have agreed completely. Most people mistake conditioned thought patterns for truth. They inherit fears, beliefs, insecurities, and assumptions without ever questioning their origin. Then they call that conditioning personality. The Kybalion challenged this directly. It taught that reality responds differently depending on the quality of consciousness perceiving it, not through magic tricks or fantasy, but through subtle psychological law. Your thoughts influence emotional state. Emotional state influences perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. The process feels invisible because it happens gradually. A man who constantly repeats thoughts of failure begins speaking hesitantly, acting cautiously, avoiding opportunities. expecting disappointment before action even begins. Eventually, life appears to confirm his assumptions. Meanwhile, another person with disciplined belief moves through uncertainty differently. Their emotional state alters their posture, attention, resilience, and persistence. The outer world reflects the inner structure. That is why ancient Hermetic teachings emphasized self-mastery over external control. They believed conquering the mind was the highest form of power because every human experience passes through consciousness first. Nothing enters your reality without interpretation. Marcus Aurelius later reflected similar ideas in Meditations when he wrote that life is shaped by the color of one's thoughts. Though Stoicism and Hermeticism differed in style, both traditions recognize the same principle. Perception quietly governs experience, and perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in moments of suffering. Two people lose money. One interprets it as proof life is against them. Another sees it as temporary hardship and adapts. Two people experience rejection. One collapses into bitterness. Another transforms pain into growth. The circumstances may wound both individuals equally, but consciousness determines the long-term meaning assigned to the event. Meaning shapes identity. Identity shapes action. Action shapes destiny. This is why the Egyptian mystery schools treated thought as sacred force rather than random mental noise. They believed every repeated thought strengthened a corresponding inner condition. Fear strengthened weakness. Discipline strengthened clarity. Gratitude strengthened perception. Attention strengthened awareness. The mind was not entertainment. It was architecture. Imagine a builder constructing a temple one stone at a time. Each stone appears insignificant alone, yet over years the structure becomes immovable. Thought functions the same way. Most people underestimate the power of repeated internal dialogue because individual thoughts seem harmless. But repeated daily for years, they become emotional foundations. The ancients knew this. That is why initiates practiced mental vigilance so intensely. Not perfection, vigilance, because the mind always moves toward repetition, and repetition becomes identity. A person who constantly says, "Nothing ever works for me," eventually stops recognizing opportunity. Someone who repeatedly believes they are powerless unconsciously behaves that way. Meanwhile, disciplined inner language slowly reorganizes emotional expectation and perception. This does not mean denying hardship or pretending pain does not exist. The Hermetic teachings were never about fantasy optimism. They were about conscious participation, about recognizing that inner condition affects outer experience more than most people realize. The quality of consciousness matters. Everything begins there. So tonight, begin with one simple practice. Observe your dominant thoughts without judgment. Not occasional thoughts, repeated ones. The phrases your mind whispers automatically, the assumptions you repeat without noticing. Because according to the oldest Hermetic law, those thoughts are not passive, they are seeds. And eventually, every repeated seed grows. Chapter 2, Hermes Trismegistus and the Lost Science of Vibration. Long before modern psychology studied behavior, before neuroscience mapped emotional patterns, before philosophy separated itself from mysticism, there were whispered stories about a mysterious figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Some believed he was a man. Others believed he was a symbolic fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, the divine keeper of wisdom, writing, and hidden knowledge. His name meant thrice greatest, and according to ancient legends, he possessed understanding so profound that kings, priests, and initiates guarded his teachings for centuries inside sealed temples and sacred texts. Among those teachings was a dangerous idea: everything in existence vibrates, not only matter. Consciousness itself. This became one of the central principles later echoed inside the Kybalion. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Ancient Hermetic thinkers observed that human beings carried invisible emotional atmospheres affecting thought, behavior, and perception. Long before scientific language existed for nervous systems or emotional contagion, they recognized that emotional states influenced reality in subtle but undeniable ways. You have already felt this principle without realizing it. Walk into a room after an argument, and tension hangs in the air before anyone speaks. Sit beside a calm person, and your nervous system begins relaxing without explanation. Encounter someone consumed by bitterness, and their emotional condition affects the entire environment around them. The ancients called this vibration. Modern people call it mood, psychology, energy, emotional presence, or social influence. Different words, same observation. Hermetic initiates believed emotional discipline mattered because consciousness radiates outward through behavior, attention, speech, and perception. A fearful mind notices danger everywhere. A grateful mind notices opportunity. A bitter mind unconsciously searches for conflict. Internal vibration changes external interpretation. Reality begins mirroring emotional expectation. Inside ancient temples connected to Hermetic teachings, students reportedly spent years learning control over breath, speech, attention, and emotional reaction before deeper wisdom was revealed. Why? Because uncontrolled emotion distorted perception. An unstable mind could not perceive clearly. This is why so many ancient philosophies emphasized inner stillness. Not because silence was mystical decoration, but because mental noise weakened awareness. Imagine standing beside a lake during a storm. The surface becomes chaotic, distorted, impossible to see through. But when the water becomes still, reflection sharpens naturally. Hermetic teachers believed consciousness worked the same way. Emotional turbulence distorts perception. Calm awareness restores clarity. That is why vibration was never merely about feeling positive. The teaching was deeper than modern self-help simplifications. It was about emotional coherence, stability, awareness, intentional inner condition. A person trapped in constant anger vibrates differently than someone grounded in discipline. A desperate mind behaves differently than a centered one, and behavior, repeated long enough, changes outcomes. This is where vibration becomes practical instead of mystical. The businessman who panics under pressure makes poorer decisions. The fearful speaker weakens their own communication before speaking. The chronically resentful person damages relationships unconsciously. Meanwhile, calm individuals often perceive possibilities others miss because emotional chaos no longer dominates their attention. The inner condition shapes the visible result. Hermes Trismegistus taught that the universe itself reflected hidden order. The visible world was not random chaos, but layered intelligence operating through laws. Most people suffered because they lived unconsciously inside those laws instead of understanding them. And perhaps the most dangerous ignorance of all was ignorance of one's own mind. Because unconscious emotion silently shapes destiny, the ancients understood this so deeply that initiates were warned never to speak carelessly about themselves. Repeated speech became reinforced identity. Identity became behavior. Behavior became reality. Words mattered. Emotion mattered. Attention mattered. Everything vibrated, so the practical lesson hidden inside this ancient wisdom is simple but not easy. Become aware of your emotional frequency before attempting to change your external life. Observe the atmosphere you carry into conversations, work, relationships, and decisions, because according to Hermetic law, your inner condition is never isolated. It radiates outward constantly, and over time reality responds accordingly. Chapter 3: The Principle of Vibration. Ancient Hermetic teachers made a strange claim long before modern science discovered atoms, frequencies, and invisible energetic movement. Nothing in existence is truly still. The stone temple appears motionless. The mountain appears permanent. The human body appears solid. Yet beneath appearances, everything moves. Everything vibrates. The stars move through endless darkness. The oceans rise and fall with invisible rhythms. Even the human heart survives through constant motion. Stillness, according to Hermetic wisdom, is often an illusion created by limited perception, and perhaps most important of all, the mind vibrates too. The Kybalion described thoughts and emotions as energetic conditions existing on different levels of vibration. Fear, hatred, shame, envy, courage, gratitude, love, discipline, these were not merely emotions. They were states of consciousness influencing how reality was experienced. You can observe this principle in ordinary life. A frightened person enters a conversation already expecting danger. Their body tightens. Their attention narrows. Neutral words suddenly feel threatening. Small setbacks feel catastrophic. Fear alters perception before reality even has a chance to speak for itself. Meanwhile, someone grounded in calm awareness sees the exact same situation differently. Their nervous system remains open. Their thinking stays flexible. Possibilities remain visible. Solutions appear where panic once created blindness. Same world, different vibration. This is why ancient initiates considered emotional mastery a sacred discipline rather than a luxury. They believed uncontrolled emotional states distorted consciousness the same way violent waves distort the reflection of the moon upon water. A disturbed mind cannot perceive clearly. Centuries ago, Hermetic students entering mystery schools were often isolated before receiving higher teachings. Silence, fasting, breath control, observation. Why? Because emotional chaos weakened perception. A reactive mind became trapped inside illusion. Before initiates could understand cosmic law, they first had to understand their own emotional rhythms. The ancients feared unconscious emotion more than external enemies, because emotion shapes interpretation, and interpretation shapes reality. Consider a man consumed by resentment. Over time, he begins interpreting ordinary interactions through suspicion. Compliments seem manipulative. Silence feels disrespectful. Success in others becomes personal insult. Gradually, his emotional state reorganizes his perception until life itself appears hostile. Then he asks why reality feels cruel, but another person carries a different internal vibration entirely. They enter life with emotional steadiness, patience, gratitude, and disciplined thought. They are not immune to suffering. Hermetic teachings never promised that, but their consciousness responds differently to hardship. They recover faster, adapt faster, notice opportunities others overlook. Emotional clarity improves perception. That changes outcomes. This is one reason highly emotional states often create poor decisions. Fear narrows awareness. Desperation weakens judgment. Rage destroys perspective. Ancient Stoics and Hermetic teachers agreed on this point completely. When emotion dominates consciousness unconsciously, human beings lose sovereignty over themselves. Reaction replaces awareness. and reaction becomes destiny. The principle of vibration also explains why environments affect people so deeply. Walk into a room filled with conflict, and the body senses tension immediately. Spend time around chronically negative individuals, and emotional heaviness slowly spreads. Even modern psychology recognizes emotional contagion, the unconscious transfer of emotional states between human beings. The ancients recognized this thousands of years ago. They simply used different language. A temple was not only architecture, it
was atmosphere.
Sacred rituals were not only symbolic, they altered emotional and mental states. Chanting, incense, silence, geometric design, candlelight, all were used to influence consciousness intentionally. Ancient civilizations understood that repeated emotional environments shape inner condition over time. Modern people experience this principle constantly without noticing. Hours of outrage-driven media lower emotional vibrations through fear and anger. Endless distraction fragments attention. Chronic comparison creates emotional exhaustion. Gradually, consciousness becomes conditioned into anxiety, reactivity, and mental fatigue. Then people wonder why clarity disappears. The mind absorbs atmosphere. That is why Hermetic wisdom emphasized conscious emotional cultivation, not emotional suppression. Cultivation, there is a difference. Susceptible fear traps it beneath awareness where it quietly controls behavior. But observing fear consciously transforms the relationship entirely. The emotion loses unconscious authority. Awareness interrupts automatic reaction. This is the beginning of mental alchemy. A frightened person can become observant instead of panicked. Anger can become disciplined action instead of destruction. Grief can deepen compassion instead of bitterness. Hermetic teachers called this process transmutation, the deliberate shifting of lower emotional states into higher ones through conscious awareness, not instantly, but intentionally. Imagine an old musician tuning an instrument before a performance. The strings are tightened carefully until harmony emerges. Human consciousness operates similarly. Emotional states constantly influence mental clarity, attention, speech, and action. When vibration becomes chaotic, life often follows. But when inner condition stabilizes, perception changes first. Then behavior changes, then reality itself begins responding differently. This is why elevated emotional states often produce extraordinary resilience. Gratitude sharpens perception toward opportunity. Discipline stabilizes action. Calmness improves decision-making. Courage expands possibility. Love dissolves excessive fear. These are not abstract spiritual ideas alone. They are psychological conditions altering the quality of consciousness itself, and consciousness shapes lived experience. The ancients understood this deeply enough to guard it inside mystery traditions for generations, because once a human being realizes emotional state influences perception, behavior, and outcome, responsibility becomes unavoidable. You can no longer blame reality entirely for the atmosphere within you, and that realization changes everything. So begin with one simple practice. Observe your emotional state throughout the day without immediately obeying it. Notice how fear changes perception. Notice how gratitude changes awareness. Notice how calmness alters decisions. Because according to Hermetic law, every emotional state carries its own vibration, and eventually your dominant vibration becomes the lens through which reality is experienced. Chapter 4. Plato's Cave and the Illusion of Reality. More than 2,000 years ago, Plato told a story that still unsettles human beings today. He spoke of prisoners chained inside a dark cave since birth. Their heads were fixed forward so completely that they could only stare at the wall before them. Behind them burned a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, figures carried objects whose shadows danced across the stone wall. The prisoners believed those shadows were reality. How could they think otherwise? Shadows were all they had ever known. But one prisoner eventually escaped the cave. At first the outside world blinded him. Sunlight felt painful. Reality appeared overwhelming. Yet slowly his eyes adjusted, and for the first time he saw the world directly, instead of through distorted projection. Then he returned to tell the others, and they rejected him completely, because illusion feels safer than transformation. Plato's allegory was philosophical, but Hermetic teachers recognized something profoundly metaphysical within it. Human beings rarely experience reality objectively. They experience conditioned interpretation. That distinction changes everything. Most people assume their perception is accurate simply because it feels familiar. Yet, perception is shaped by memory, fear, emotional conditioning, cultural programming, trauma, desire, and repeated thought. Two individuals can experience the same event while living inside entirely different psychological realities. One sees rejection, another sees redirection, one sees humiliation, another sees instruction, one sees impossibility, another sees challenge. Consciousness determines interpretation long before logic enters the conversation. The Hermetic traditions echoed this through the principle of mentalism. Reality is filtered through mind. Plato approached the same truth philosophically. Human beings mistake shadows for truth because they rarely question the assumptions shaping perception itself. And perhaps the greatest illusion of all is the illusion of identity. A man repeatedly told he is weak eventually sees weakness everywhere within himself. A child raised inside fear unconsciously interprets uncertainty as danger. A person conditioned by failure begins expecting limitation automatically. Over time, assumptions harden into identity, then identity begins organizing perception. The cave becomes psychological. Carl Jung later explored similar ideas when describing unconscious projection. Human beings project internal fears, desires, and unresolved emotions outward onto reality itself. The outer world becomes a mirror reflecting unseen inner conditions. The ancients understood this long before modern psychology existed. That is why initiates entering mystery traditions were often required to confront themselves before receiving deeper wisdom. They had to observe how much of reality was being distorted by unconscious belief. Pride distorted truth, fear distorted judgment, desire distorted perception, emotional attachment clouded awareness. The cave was not outside, it was within consciousness itself. And escaping it required courage. Because awakening is uncomfortable, imagine a man who has spent decades believing life is against him. Every disappointment reinforces the story. Every hardship becomes proof. Then one day he begins questioning the assumption itself. Suddenly he notices opportunities he once ignored. He recognizes how fear shaped his behavior. He sees how resentment distorted relationships. Reality begins changing, not because the world magically transformed overnight, but because perception itself evolved. The prisoner leaves the cave. This is why ancient philosophy repeatedly emphasized self-knowledge. The famous inscription at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi read, "Know thyself," not merely as moral advice, but as liberation. Because until a person understands the forces shaping their own perception, they remain trapped inside unconscious interpretation, and unconscious interpretation silently creates suffering. The Stoics understood this too. Epictetus taught that human beings are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their judgments about events. External reality matters, of course, but internal meaning determines psychological experience. Meaning shapes emotion. Emotion shapes behavior. Behavior shapes destiny. Plato's cave reveals something most people spend their lives avoiding. Reality is often less limiting than perception. Human beings inherit invisible chains long before they notice them. Fear, shame, cultural conditioning, emotional wounds, scarcity thinking, repeated assumptions, these become shadows mistaken for truth. Then people defend the cave passionately because familiar suffering feels safer than unknown freedom. But the ancient teachers insisted something greater existed beyond conditioned perception. Higher truth, clearer awareness, a more disciplined consciousness capable of seeing reality without constant distortion. This is why questioning automatic assumptions becomes such a powerful spiritual act. Not every thought is truth, not every fear is prophecy, not every emotional reaction deserves obedience. The cave begins weakening the moment awareness awakens. So today, begin noticing your shadows. Observe the beliefs you rarely question, the assumptions that feel automatic, the emotional interpretations you repeat constantly. Because according to both Plato and the Hermetic sages, freedom begins the moment consciousness realizes it has been staring at shadows all along. Chapter 5. The Secret of Mental Transmutation. There was once an ancient belief whispered inside Hermetic temples that terrified ordinary minds. Human emotion could be transformed the same way alchemists transformed metal, not suppressed, not denied. Transformed. The Hermetic initiates called this process mental transmutation, and according to the Kybalion, it was one of the greatest hidden powers available to human beings. Most people, the teachings claimed, remain slaves to emotional reaction. Anger controls them, fear freezes them, jealousy poisons perception, shame weakens identity. Their inner world changes constantly according to circumstance, and because of this, their lives become unstable reflections of emotional chaos. But the initiates trained for something different, sovereignty. They believed emotions were forms of energy moving through consciousness. Left unconscious, they created destruction. Directed intentionally, they became fuel. This was the deeper meaning behind ancient alchemy. Modern people often imagine alchemy as primitive attempts to turn lead into gold, but many Hermetic traditions treated physical alchemy as symbolic language for inner transformation. Lead represented the unconscious self, fearful, reactive, emotionally heavy. Gold represented disciplined consciousness, clear, stable, awakened. The real laboratory was the mind, and suffering was often the fire. Imagine a man insulted publicly in front of others. One version of him reacts instantly with rage. His emotions seize control before awareness arrives. Harsh words follow. Relationships fracture. Regret appears later like smoke after a fire. In that moment, emotion ruled consciousness completely. But another man experiences the same insult differently. He feels the anger rise within him, hot, immediate, powerful, but instead of obeying it automatically, he observes it. He breathes, he pauses. The emotional energy remains, but awareness redirects it. Instead of explosive reaction, the energy becomes clarity, discipline, controlled strength, same emotion, different consciousness. That is mental transmutation. The Stoics practiced similar principles. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that external events were not fully under his control, but his response always remained his responsibility. Epictetus warned that emotional impulsiveness created slavery of the soul. The Hermetic initiates would have agreed. A reactive person becomes predictable, controlled by circumstance. controlled by emotion, controlled by the external world, but conscious emotional mastery changes the relationship entirely. The ancients considered this sacred power because most people never realize emotions can be redirected rather than obeyed blindly. Fear becomes a perfect example. Fear, left unconscious, becomes paralysis. It narrows thought, weakens action, and distorts perception. But fear observed consciously becomes heightened awareness. The frightened hunter becomes alert. The disciplined warrior becomes precise. The wise traveler becomes cautious instead of reckless. Emotion itself is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is. This is why Hermetic teachings never encouraged emotional numbness. They encouraged awareness powerful enough to alter emotional direction. Anger could become determination. Pain could become wisdom. Grief could deepen compassion. Desire could become disciplined creation instead of addiction. The energy remained, its expression changed. Ancient stories repeatedly symbolize this process through fire. Fire destroys carelessly, but directed properly, it cooks food, forges steel, and warms entire civilizations. Human emotion functions similarly. The same emotional force that ruins one life can strengthen another depending on consciousness. That is why emotionally reactive people often feel exhausted. Their energy constantly leaks outward through unconscious speech, impulsive behavior, endless worry, and internal conflict. Meanwhile, disciplined individuals conserve emotional energy through awareness. They do not suppress emotion, they govern it. This distinction matters enormously. Suppressed emotion hides beneath consciousness and quietly shapes behavior from the shadows. A man who suppresses anger may appear calm while resentment poisons him internally for years. A person who suppresses fear may unconsciously avoid opportunity while pretending confidence outwardly. Hermetic mastery required honesty first. The initiate acknowledged the emotion fully before redirecting it intentionally. This is where transformation begins. The old alchemical symbol of turning lead into gold suddenly becomes psychological truth. Human beings carry heavy emotional states within them: fear, envy, bitterness, insecurity, shame. Most remain trapped there permanently because they identify with those emotions completely. But the Hermetic path taught something radical. You are not the emotion itself. You are the consciousness observing and directing it. That realization changes everything. Imagine a sailor caught in violent storms. An untrained sailor panics, loses direction, and sinks. But an experienced navigator uses the same winds differently. Awareness transforms chaos into movement. Likewise, emotional mastery does not remove storms from life. It teaches navigation, and navigation determines destiny. This is why ancient mystery schools demanded patience from initiates. Emotional mastery cannot be learned intellectually alone. It requires observation in real moments of difficulty, during humiliation, during uncertainty, during temptation, during fear. Anyone can speak about consciousness in comfort. Transformation is tested in discomfort. The Hermetic teachers understood that every emotional reaction either strengthened unconsciousness or strengthened awareness. Every moment became training. Every challenge revealed inner condition. Every frustration exposed hidden weakness, still waiting to be mastered. The process never truly ends. But slowly, something extraordinary begins happening. The individual who once reacted automatically becomes more stable, more observant, more deliberate. Emotional storms still appear, but they no longer dominate consciousness completely. Space emerges between feeling and action, and inside that space, freedom begins. So the practical lesson is simple, though difficult. Stop treating emotions as commands. Observe them first, redirect them consciously. When anger appears, channel it into disciplined action instead of destruction. When fear appears, use it to sharpen awareness instead of collapsing into paralysis. Because, according to the ancient Hermetic masters, emotional energy is never wasted. It is either ruling you unconsciously or becoming fuel for transformation. Chapter 6, The Principle of Correspondence. There is a phrase from the ancient emerald tablet that survived thousands of years because human beings sensed something profound hidden within it. As above, so below. Few Hermetic teachings became more influential than this one. Philosophers contemplated it. Alchemists encoded it into symbols. Mystics guarded it inside secret traditions. At first glance, the phrase appears mysterious and poetic, but the deeper initiates believed it described one of the fundamental laws governing human existence itself. Pause, repeat, within nature, within consciousness, within destiny. The ancients observed that invisible causes often revealed themselves through visible effects. Internal disorder eventually appeared externally. Inner harmony slowly influenced outward behavior and circumstance. Emotional patterns repeated so consistently that they became life patterns. The outer world mirrored the inner condition, not perfectly, not instantly, but persistently. Imagine entering the home of someone consumed by chaos internally. Often the environment reflects it: unfinished tasks, neglected responsibilities, disorder spreading quietly across ordinary life. Meanwhile, a deeply disciplined person often creates external order naturally because their inner structure expresses itself outwardly. The correspondence begins within consciousness first. A fearful mind creates hesitant action. Hesitant action creates missed opportunities. Missed opportunities reinforce fear. The pattern becomes self-sustaining. Meanwhile, disciplined confidence creates decisive behavior. Decisive behavior creates experience. Experience strengthens identity. Inner state becomes external rhythm. This is why Hermetic teachers treated self-observation as sacred practice. They believed human beings unconsciously repeated emotional patterns until awareness interrupted them. A person carrying resentment into every relationship eventually experiences repeated conflict. Someone trapped in insecurity unconsciously interprets neutral situations through rejection and doubt. Then they wonder why life keeps repeating itself. The ancients would have answered simply, because consciousness repeats what it has not transformed. This idea appeared everywhere in symbolic alchemy. Ancient alchemists spoke constantly about purification, balance, refinement, and transformation, but many of these symbols referred not only to metals, but to the human psyche itself. The chaotic inner world had to be purified before higher understanding became possible. Otherwise, distortion continued endlessly. A bitter person perceives bitterness everywhere. A grateful person notices beauty others ignore. A desperate person behaves differently than a centered one. Internal atmosphere influences perception so deeply that it quietly reorganizes reality around itself. This is correspondence in motion. Carl Jung later approached similar territory psychologically through projection and archetypal repetition. Human beings unconsciously recreate unresolved inner conditions externally. Childhood fears become adult patterns. Unhealed wounds shape relationships. Hidden insecurity influences behavior without conscious awareness. The Hermetic teachers recognized this long before modern psychology existed. They simply described it spiritually instead of clinically. Ancient initiates therefore focused intensely on internal reactions rather than external control. Why? Because reactions revealed inner condition. Anyone could appear calm when life was easy. But pressure exposed consciousness honestly. A delayed insult reveals ego, loss reveals attachment, uncertainty reveals fear, conflict reveals emotional discipline or lack of it. Life becomes mirror. This is why many spiritual traditions describe the world as a teacher. Not because suffering is automatically noble, but because external conditions constantly expose internal patterns waiting to be understood. The impatient person encounters situations demanding patience. The fearful person repeatedly meets uncertainty. The prideful person eventually collides with humiliation. Reality reflects consciousness until awareness evolves. The frightening part is how subtle this process becomes. Most people never notice the emotional patterns quietly organizing their lives. They repeat the same reactions for decades while blaming external circumstances entirely. The same relationship dynamics, the same self-sabotage, the same fear, the same insecurity, different faces, same pattern. The ancients considered this unconscious repetition a form of sleep. Awareness awakens the cycle, and once awareness appears, responsibility follows. This does not mean every hardship is self-created or every event is magically controlled by thought. Hermetic teachings were more nuanced than modern fantasy interpretations. External reality remains complex, but consciousness still determines interpretation, behavior, resilience, and emotional atmosphere within that reality. That influence is enormous. A disciplined inner state changes how challenges are faced. Calmness improves perception. Gratitude expands awareness. Fear contracts possibility. Resentment poisons judgment. Over years, those inner conditions shape vastly different lives. The correspondence becomes undeniable. Imagine planting seeds in two gardens. One is neglected constantly. The other is tended carefully each day. Eventually, the difference becomes visible externally, though it began invisibly beneath the surface. Consciousness works the same way. Thoughts, emotional habits, reactions, and assumptions become seeds repeated daily. Eventually, they appear outwardly. This is why the Hermetic sages insisted that mastery begins within. Trying to control external reality without understanding internal condition is like attempting to calm ocean waves while ignoring the storm creating them. Inner order precedes lasting external order. So begin watching your reactions carefully. Not your public performance, your automatic inner responses. Observe recurring emotional patterns honestly. Because according to the ancient principle of correspondence, your inner world is not isolated from your outer life. It is quietly shaping it, moment by moment, day by day, thought by thought. Chapter 7. Why most people remain energetically weak. The ancient initiates believed most human beings were not physically exhausted first. They were mentally scattered. Long before modern technology flooded human attention with endless noise, Hermetic teachers warned that fragmented consciousness weakens perception, discipline, and inner power. A distracted mind loses force the same way sunlight loses intensity when spread across an entire field instead of focused through a single burning lens. Attention is energy, and where attention constantly leaks, vitality slowly disappears. The ancient mystery schools understood this deeply. That is why initiates were removed from chaos before receiving higher teachings. They entered silent chambers, stone temples, desert isolation, sacred routines. Outsiders often assumed these practices were merely ceremonial, but they served a psychological purpose far greater than ritual alone. The mind had to become concentrated before truth could be perceived clearly, because scattered consciousness creates inner weakness. Imagine trying to see your reflection in water constantly disturbed by stones. The image breaks apart endlessly. Ancient teachers believed modern consciousness functioned similarly. Endless stimulation, emotional reaction, gossip, fear, distraction, comparison, and noise shattered mental clarity until people lost connection with their own inner awareness entirely. Then they mistook exhaustion for normal life. Today, this condition has become almost universal. Human beings wake each morning and immediately surrender attention to alarms, headlines, arguments, notifications, fear-driven media, endless comparison, emotional outrage, and constant stimulation. The nervous system never fully rests. Thought becomes fragmented, emotional reactions become automatic. Attention jumps endlessly from one thing to another without depth or stillness. Then people wonder why they feel powerless. Because consciousness weakens wherever attention scatters continuously. The ancients would not have been surprised. In fact, many Hermetic traditions described unconscious humanity as spiritually asleep, not because people lacked intelligence, but because their awareness remained controlled by external stimulation instead of disciplined intention. Reaction replaced observation, impulse replaced sovereignty, and emotional exhaustion quietly became identity. You can observe this phenomenon everywhere. A person spends hours consuming negativity each day, then wonders why anxiety grows stronger. Another constantly compares their life to others until dissatisfaction poisons perception completely. Someone else moves through life without silence, without reflection, without conscious stillness, until their mind becomes crowded with noise they no longer recognize as noise. The inner world becomes overcrowded, and overcrowded consciousness loses power. Ancient initiates protected their mental environments carefully because they understood a dangerous truth. Whatever repeatedly enters the mind eventually shapes emotional atmosphere. The words you hear repeatedly matter. The images you consume matter. The emotional environments surrounding you matter. Attention gradually becomes conditioned by repetition. This is why many ancient philosophies emphasized withdrawal from unnecessary chaos, not permanent isolation from life, but intentional protection of consciousness. Stoic philosophers practiced periods of silence and reflection. Taoist sages retreated into nature to restore harmony within themselves. Hermetic initiates guarded speech, company, and emotional atmosphere with extraordinary discipline. They understood that mental energy is finite, and unconscious living wastes enormous amounts of it. Imagine carrying water in a cracked vessel. No matter how much is poured in, the leaks prevent fullness from remaining. Human attention works the same way. Endless worry leaks energy. Constant outrage leaks energy. Reactive emotional habits leak energy. Chronic distraction leaks energy. Over time, consciousness weakens beneath the weight of fragmentation. This is why emotionally reactive people often feel exhausted even without physical labor. Internal conflict consumes vitality constantly. Fear drains attention. Resentment drains attention. Overthinking drains attention. The nervous system becomes trapped in endless unconscious activity. Ancient wisdom sought the opposite condition entirely. Centered awareness, focused consciousness, stillness strong enough to resist external chaos. A disciplined mind carries tremendous energetic force because its attention remains unified rather than scattered. Such individuals often appear calm even under pressure because their consciousness is no longer constantly hijacked by emotional impulse. The Stoics trained this intentionally. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself daily so external events would not dominate his internal condition. Epictetus warned students not to surrender mental sovereignty to every disturbance. The Hermetic initiates practiced similar disciplines through concentration, breath control, observation, and silence, because wherever attention goes repeatedly, energy follows. And whatever receives energy consistently becomes stronger. Fear grows through attention. Distraction grows through attention. Resentment grows through attention. But discipline grows through attention too. So does clarity, so does awareness. The terrifying truth is that many people never consciously direct their attention at all. Their focus is captured externally every moment of the day, profiting from distraction, stimulation, emotional reactivity, and psychological fragmentation. The ancients would have called this a form of slavery, not physical chains, mental ones. And freedom begins the moment awareness returns. That is why reclaiming attention becomes such a sacred act. Every moment of intentional stillness strengthens consciousness. Every interruption of unconscious distraction restores energy gradually. Every disciplined refusal to feed emotional chaos rebuilds inner authority. Power returns slowly, but it returns. So begin protecting your mental environment deliberately. Observe what repeatedly enters your mind. Notice which conversations weaken you. Notice which emotional habits exhaust you. Notice how scattered attention affects your clarity, mood, and perception. Because according to the ancient initiates, consciousness becomes powerful only when attention stops leaking in every direction at once. A focused mind changes everything. Chapter 8. Aristotle and the Law of Cause and Effect. Aristotle once observed something simple that most human beings spend their lives ignoring. Destiny is often built through repetition long before dramatic results appear. The ancient Greek philosopher did not speak in mystical riddles like many Hermetic teachers. His wisdom was quieter, rational, grounded. Yet beneath his disciplined philosophy lived a truth that echoed directly into Hermetic law itself, the principle that every effect emerges from prior causes. Nothing appears from nowhere. Every condition grows from something repeated. A tree begins as a seed. A civilization begins as an idea. Character begins as habit. And destiny begins with small patterns so ordinary that most people overlook them completely. The ancients understood this deeply. While Hermetic philosophers described energetic laws governing consciousness, Aristotle examined the structure of human behavior itself. He noticed that repeated action gradually shapes identity. A person does not become disciplined through one decision. They become disciplined through repeated choices, strengthening the same inner pattern again and again. Habit becomes character. Character becomes fate. This idea appears almost everywhere in ancient wisdom traditions because it reflects something profoundly true about human existence. Invisible causes eventually create visible realities. Imagine two men beginning life under similar circumstances. One develops small daily disciplines, careful speech, emotional restraint, thoughtful action, consistent effort. None of these behaviors appear dramatic initially. Years pass quietly, but gradually his internal structures strengthens. Opportunities increase, relationships deepen. Confidence grows because behavior reinforces identity repeatedly. The second man neglects small disciplines entirely. He speaks impulsively, avoids discomfort, reacts emotionally, ignores consistency. Again, no single moment appears catastrophic. But over years, repetition shapes character silently. Different causes, different outcomes, This is the law of cause and effect unfolding invisibly through ordinary life. The Hermetic teachings later expanded this principle metaphysically. They taught that thoughts themselves become causes. Emotional states become causes. Attention becomes cause. Repeated assumptions become causes. Human beings constantly generate effects through consciousness, whether they recognize it or not. Most people only notice effects after they fully appear. By then, the causes have already been repeated for years. A fearful person rarely becomes fearful overnight. The condition forms gradually through repeated interpretation. Likewise, confidence forms through repeated, courageous behavior. Emotional resilience develops through repeated confrontation with discomfort instead of avoidance. Consciousness is shaped by repetition. This is why Aristotle emphasized rational discipline so strongly. He understood that emotions fluctuate constantly, but disciplined behavior creates stability beneath emotional chaos. A person who depends entirely on temporary motivation becomes inconsistent, but someone governed by deliberate practice builds inner order regardless of emotional weather. The ancients respected this tremendously, because disciplined repetition eventually creates energetic coherence. Imagine a blacksmith forging a sword. One strike changes little, but thousands of repeated strikes slowly shape metal into something strong and precise. Human consciousness develops similarly. Tiny repeated behaviors, thoughts, reactions, habits, emotional patterns forge identity over time. Most people underestimate small actions because effects appear delayed. But delay does not mean absence. A man repeatedly feeding bitterness may not notice consequences immediately, yet resentment slowly reshapes perception. A person constantly practicing gratitude gradually trains awareness toward possibility instead of deficiency. Repeated fear narrows life. Repeated courage expands it. Cause becomes effect. Then effect reinforces cause. This cycle explains why unconscious habits become so powerful. Human beings eventually stop noticing behaviors repeated daily. Complaining becomes automatic. Worry becomes automatic. Negative self-talk becomes automatic. Emotional reactivity becomes automatic. The repeated cause disappears beneath familiarity, yet the effects continue growing. Ancient Stoics recognized this danger clearly. Marcus Aurelius warned himself constantly against unconscious thinking because repeated mental habits hardened into character. The Hermetic initiates practiced similar vigilance. They believed every repeated thought strengthened a corresponding condition within consciousness itself. Attention strengthened fear. Attention strengthened discipline. Attention strengthened identity. Nothing remained neutral. This understanding also explains why transformation feels difficult initially. When a person attempts changing long-established patterns, they confront years of accumulated repetition already shaping identity unconsciously. Old habits resist because repetition created familiarity. Familiarity creates psychological gravity. But Aristotle believed disciplined practice could reshape character gradually, and the Hermetic teachers agreed. Tiny intentional actions repeated consistently begin reorganizing consciousness itself. One moment of patience interrupts years of impulsiveness. One disciplined morning interrupts years of chaos. One conscious emotional response weakens unconscious reaction slightly. Over time, new causes create new effects. The process appears slow until suddenly it becomes visible. This is why ancient wisdom traditions valued consistency more than intensity. Emotional bursts fade quickly, but repeated disciplined behavior reshapes identity permanently. A calm person becomes calm through practice. A focused mind becomes focused through training. Emotional stability strengthens through repeated conscious responses under pressure. The invisible becomes visible eventually, always. So the practical lesson hidden inside both Aristotle's philosophy and Hermetic law is this: stop ignoring small causes simply because results are delayed. Observe the tiny repeated behaviors shaping your consciousness daily, the thoughts you rehearse, the emotional reactions you repeat, the habits you excuse because they seem insignificant. Nothing repeated remains insignificant forever, because according to both ancient philosophy and Hermetic wisdom, destiny rarely arrives suddenly, it accumulates quietly. One thought, one habit, one reaction at a time. Chapter 9, The Principle of Polarity. A man loses everything in a single year, his business collapses, trusted friends disappear, and fear settles into his mind like winter fog. At night he lies awake, staring into darkness, convinced his life has become permanently broken. Yet years later, that same man describes the collapse as the beginning of his awakening. The suffering that nearly destroyed him became the force that rebuilt him differently. The ancients would have understood this transformation immediately, because according to the Hermetic principle of polarity, opposites are often not separate forces at all, but different degrees of the same energy. Hot and cold belong to temperature, light and darkness belong to illumination. Likewise, fear and courage belong to the same emotional spectrum. Hatred and love emerge from the same intensity of human feeling. This was one of the hidden secrets taught within Hermetic traditions. Emotional states can shift because they are not fixed identities. They are positions on a continuum, and awareness changes position. The Kybalion described polarity as a universal law woven through existence itself. Everything contains duality. Every emotional state carries its opposite potential hidden within it. Ancient initiates studied this carefully because they realized emotional suffering often became permanent only when people identified with it completely. A fearful person says, "I am fear." An angry person says, "I am anger." But the Hermetic teachers insisted something radical. Emotions move, consciousness observes, and what can move can also be redirected. This understanding transformed how initiates approached inner struggle. Instead of waging war against emotion, they learned to shift it gradually through awareness and disciplined attention. A freezing room is not transformed into warmth instantly. Heat rises degree by degree. Likewise, courage often emerges slowly from fear rather than appearing suddenly. The movement matters. Ancient mystery schools trained students to observe emotional extremes without becoming enslaved by them. Why? Because unconscious emotional swings weakened perception. Someone trapped in hatred could no longer think clearly. Someone consumed by grief lost connection to perspective. Someone intoxicated by pride became blind to truth. Emotion distorted consciousness when left ungoverned, so initiates practiced emotional transmutation, not suppression, not denial. Transformation. Imagine a warrior before battle. Fear rises naturally within him. The untrained mind collapses into panic. But the disciplined initiate redirects fear into heightened awareness. Breathing sharpens, attention focuses, instinct awakens. The same emotional energy changes form through conscious direction. Fear becomes readiness. This principle appears everywhere in ordinary life once you notice it. A person experiencing heartbreak may descend into bitterness or awaken deeper compassion. Anger may become destruction or disciplined ambition. Pain may create cynicism or wisdom, same energy, different direction. The ancients believed this ability separated unconscious living from conscious mastery. Most people react emotionally without awareness, swinging endlessly between extremes controlled by circumstance. One compliment creates confidence, one criticism creates collapse, one success creates arrogance, one setback creates despair. The emotional pendulum rules them completely. But Hermetic teachings insisted emotional freedom begins when consciousness learns to observe polarity instead of drowning inside it. Carl Jung explored similar territory centuries later through the integration of opposites within the psyche. He believed psychological wholeness required confronting hidden aspects of the self rather than denying them. The Hermetic initiates understood something similar long before modern psychology existed. Rejected emotions gain unconscious power. Awareness transforms them. This is why ancient wisdom repeatedly warned against extremes. Extreme attachment creates suffering. Extreme hatred blinds judgment. Extreme fear weakens action. Emotional balance was not weakness to the ancients. It was strength refined through awareness. The Stoics practiced this too. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself not to become intoxicated by praise or shattered by hardship. Emotional extremes clouded reason. Inner steadiness preserved sovereignty, and sovereignty mattered, because uncontrolled emotion made human beings predictable, manipulable, weak. Modern society often intensifies polarity unconsciously. Outrage spreads faster than calmness. Fear captures attention more easily than wisdom. Emotional extremes dominate public life because heightened reactions control human focus. Ancient initiates would have viewed this as dangerous conditioning, weakening consciousness itself. The person who cannot govern emotional polarity becomes vulnerable to every external influence. But the person who learns gradual emotional redirection develops enormous inner stability. Notice the word gradual. The Hermetic masters did not teach forceful emotional denial. Trying to leap instantly from despair into joy often creates internal conflict instead of transformation. The wiser path involves movement step by step. Fear shifts into curiosity. Curiosity shifts into cautious confidence. Confidence grows into courage. Consciousness moves deliberately, like sunrise replacing darkness slowly. This is why awareness remains so important. The moment you recognize emotional states as movable rather than permanent, possibility returns. You stop identifying completely with temporary conditions. You realize inner climate can change through disciplined observation and intentional focus. And that realization is power. So when difficult emotions appear, do not immediately declare them your identity. Observe them, study them, redirect them patiently. Because according to the principle of polarity, every emotional state already contains the potential for transformation hidden within it. The ancient initiates knew this, and once you understand it deeply, emotional suffering no longer appears quite so permanent. If this ancient wisdom is awakening something inside you, subscribe now. Then begin practicing one simple discipline. When emotional extremes appear, resist the urge to react instantly. Shift gradually instead of forcefully. Small conscious movements create profound inner change over time, because transformation rarely begins through violence, it begins through awareness. Chapter 10. Rhythm, the hidden pendulum of life. An old Hermetic teacher once compared human life to the movement of ocean tides. No wave rises forever, and no wave falls forever either. Yet most human suffering, he explained, comes from resisting this simple truth. The Kybalion called this the principle of rhythm, the law describing how all things move in cycles, swings, tides, and pendulum-like patterns. Day becomes night, winter becomes spring, empires rise and collapse, Human emotions expand and contract continuously. According to the ancient Hermetic sages, rhythm governs existence itself. Nothing remains fixed, not success, not pain, not emotional states. This principle frightened some initiates at first because it shattered the illusion of permanent control. Human beings crave stability. They want endless happiness without sorrow, endless strength without weakness, endless certainty without confusion. But the Hermetic teachers observed that life moves rhythmically, whether human beings accept it or not, and resistance increases suffering. Imagine a man experiencing great success. Praise surrounds him. Confidence grows rapidly. Emotion rises higher and higher until he begins believing the elevated state will last forever. Then life changes suddenly. Loss arrives. Failure appears. Emotional collapse follows because he never understood the pendulum would eventually swing again. The wise anticipate rhythm. The unconscious are shocked by it repeatedly. Ancient sages studied this law carefully because they recognized emotional swings as natural movements rather than absolute truth. A period of discouragement did not mean life was permanently ruined. A moment of triumph did not guarantee permanent victory. Everything moved cyclically. The seasons themselves taught this lesson constantly. A farmer does not panic during winter because he understands rhythm. He knows invisible processes continue beneath the frozen ground long before spring appears outwardly. Likewise, the Hermetic initiates learned not to interpret temporary emotional states as eternal realities. This gave them unusual resilience. Modern people often become trapped inside emotional extremes because they mistake temporary states for permanent conditions. During moments of anxiety, they believe clarity will never return. During moments of sadness, they assume joy has disappeared forever. During success, they become intoxicated by emotional highs that eventually collapse into emptiness. The pendulum swings harder when unconsciousness amplifies it. This is why the ancients valued emotional neutrality so deeply. Not emotional numbness, but balanced awareness strong enough to remain steady while life moved naturally through cycles. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly during war, political instability, betrayal, and plague. He understood external conditions changed continuously, but inner steadiness reduced unnecessary suffering. A person emotionally thrown around by every rise and fall loses sovereignty over consciousness entirely. The Hermetic teachers called this being ruled by rhythm instead of understanding it. Picture someone watching the ocean for the first time. If they panic every time a wave crashes and celebrate wildly every time the water retreats, exhaustion quickly follows. But the experienced sailor understands movement itself is natural. He adapts instead of reacting. The same principle applies psychologically. Periods of low energy arrive. Emotional heaviness appears. Motivation fluctuates. Relationships change. External conditions shift unpredictably. The unconscious mind reacts dramatically to every movement, creating additional suffering through resistance and over-identification. But awareness changes the experience entirely. The ancient initiates trained themselves to observe emotional tides without immediately obeying them. During emotional highs, they remained grounded. During emotional lows, they remembered the pendulum would move again. This stabilized consciousness tremendously. They learned patience. And patience protected perception. Modern society encourages the opposite approach entirely. Emotional extremes are constantly amplified. Endless stimulation intensifies excitement, outrage, fear, and craving. People become addicted to emotional highs while fearing emotional stillness completely. Yet constant intensity weakens the nervous system over time. The pendulum grows violent. Ancient wisdom sought rhythm without slavery to rhythm. This is why meditation, silence, breath control, and contemplation appeared across so many traditions. These practices strengthened awareness beneath emotional movement itself. Consciousness became less reactive, less impulsive, more stable. The storm still existed, but the observer inside the storm changed. The principle of rhythm also explains why impulsive decisions made during emotional extremes often create regret later. A person overwhelmed by anger speaks destructively. Someone intoxicated by excitement acts recklessly. Fear creates unnecessary retreat. Temporary emotional states generate permanent consequences. The ancients warned against this repeatedly. Pause before reacting. Because emotion swings naturally, and what feels absolutely true in one moment may appear entirely different later, once the pendulum shifts again. This understanding does not remove pain from life. The Hermetic teachings were never fantasies promising endless positivity. Instead, they offered something more durable, awareness capable of remaining centered within changing conditions. That is real strength. So when emotional waves rise within you, remember the old Hermetic law. Do not cling desperately to highs. Do not collapse completely during lows. Observe the movement without surrendering consciousness entirely to it, because rhythm governs life itself, and wisdom begins the moment you stop fighting the tide. Chapter 11. The Stoic Secret of Inner Sovereignty. Late at night, while disease spread across Rome and wars pressed against the edges of the empire, Marcus Aurelius sat alone writing private thoughts to himself by candlelight. The world around him was collapsing into uncertainty. Soldiers died, political betrayal surrounded him, plague moved silently through cities. Yet inside his journal appeared a strange and disciplined message repeated again and again. You control your mind, not events, not chaos, not the behavior of others, only your response. This became one of the great hidden powers of Stoicism. Inner sovereignty. The Stoics believed most human suffering did not emerge from events themselves, but from unconscious interpretation. Two men could face the same hardship while experiencing entirely different realities internally. One collapses into bitterness. Another grows stronger through the challenge. The external condition may remain identical, yet consciousness transforms the experience completely. Perception shapes suffering. This truth made Stoicism deeply compatible with Hermetic philosophy. Both traditions understood that consciousness acts like a filter through which reality is interpreted continuously. An uncontrolled mind magnifies fear. A disciplined mind reduces unnecessary suffering by refusing impulsive emotional reactions. The ancient Stoics did not deny pain existed. They denied that panic improved it. Imagine a traveler caught in violent rain during a long journey. One curses the sky, resists reality, and exhausts himself emotionally over conditions he cannot change. Another adjusts calmly, protects his fire, and continues moving forward. Same storm, different consciousness. Marcus Aurelius trained himself for this exact mental discipline. Every day he reminded himself that external chaos was unavoidable, but internal disorder remained a choice, strengthened through repetition. He treated emotional restraint not as suppression, but as energetic armor protecting consciousness from unnecessary fragmentation. Because every uncontrolled emotional reaction leaks power, the ancients observed this constantly. Anger clouds judgment, fear weakens perception, envy poisons awareness. Emotional impulsiveness scatters mental energy until people become exhausted, not by life itself, but by their reactions to life. Stoicism sought the opposite condition entirely, centered awareness under pressure, a mind capable of remaining stable even while circumstances changed violently. This is why Stoic teachings often sound severe to modern ears. They demanded radical self-responsibility, not because emotions were evil, but because unconscious emotional reactions created inner slavery. The person controlled by every irritation becomes predictable, controlled, manipulated by circumstance itself. But the sovereign mind remains deliberate, even during difficulty. Epictetus, born into slavery before becoming one of the greatest Stoic teachers, explained this power beautifully. He taught that human beings cannot always control what happens externally, but they retain authority over interpretation, judgment, and response. That inner authority becomes freedom no external condition can fully destroy. The Hermetic initiates understood something similar. They believed consciousness loses force whenever it becomes completely dominated by external events. A reactive mind cannot perceive clearly. Emotional storms distort reality, the same way violent winds distort water. Stillness restores clarity. Modern life constantly challenges this principle. Every headline provokes reaction. Every disagreement triggers outrage. Every inconvenience demands emotional response. People become trapped inside cycles of irritation so habitual that they stop noticing how deeply reactivity drains consciousness. The nervous system remains permanently tense. The Stoics would have considered this dangerous weakness, not because emotion itself is wrong, but because unconscious reaction steals inner sovereignty repeatedly throughout the day. A person who cannot pause before reacting loses control of perception itself, and perception shapes experience. Imagine someone insulted publicly. The uncontrolled mind reacts instantly, escalating conflict emotionally, but the disciplined mind pauses first. Awareness creates space between event and reaction. Inside that space, choice becomes possible. That pause changes destiny more often than people realize. Entire relationships survive because someone paused before speaking. Entire lives collapse because someone never learned to. The Stoics treated this discipline as sacred training because they understood that emotional mastery affects every part of existence. Even physical energy changes through emotional control. A constantly reactive person feels exhausted because the nervous system never fully rests. Emotional agitation burns enormous amounts of internal energy. Calmness conserves it. This is why ancient warriors, philosophers, and initiates practiced restraint so intensely. Calmness sharpened perception. Stillness strengthened judgment. Emotional discipline increased clarity during crisis. Order became strength. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this repeatedly. Despite ruling during catastrophe, his writings rarely descend into panic or self-pity. Instead, they return constantly to awareness, discipline, and perspective. He understood that external chaos becomes far more destructive when internal chaos joins it. So he guarded the mind carefully. The Hermetic traditions taught similar principles through different language. Consciousness determined energetic condition. Emotional reactions shaped vibration. Unconscious fear lowered perception. Calm awareness elevated it. Different philosophy, same truth. This does not mean becoming cold or emotionless. The Stoics themselves felt grief, anger, joy, and fear, but they refused to surrender authority completely to those states. Emotion visited consciousness without ruling it permanently. That distinction matters immensely because human beings become powerful the moment they realize reactions are trainable. Patience strengthens through practice. Emotional restraint strengthens through repetition. Calmness strengthens each time awareness interrupts impulsive behavior. The sovereign mind is built gradually. So the practical lesson is simple: pause before reacting emotionally. Not occasionally, constantly. Observe the emotional impulse before obeying it. Notice how quickly the mind wants to react unconsciously to discomfort, criticism, fear, or frustration. Then breathe once before responding. That single pause begins rebuilding inner sovereignty. And according to both Stoic and Hermetic wisdom, the person who governs their inner world eventually moves through external chaos very differently from everyone else. Chapter 12. Thought as invisible architecture. Most people never notice the moment a thought becomes part of their identity. It happens quietly. A man experiences failure a few times and begins repeating, "Nothing ever works for me." At first, the sentence feels temporary, a reaction to disappointment, but repetition slowly changes its weight. The thought hardens, it sinks beneath awareness. Eventually, it no longer feels like a thought at all. It feels like reality. The ancient Hermetic teachers believed this process shaped human destiny more than people realized. According to their teachings, repeated thoughts act like invisible architecture, constructing inner reality long before visible conditions appear externally. Every thought lays another stone, not instantly, but gradually. This is why ancient mystery schools guarded mental discipline so carefully. They understood consciousness was impressionable. What entered the mind repeatedly eventually shaped perception, emotional reaction, behavior, and identity itself. The subconscious absorbed repetition the same way fertile soil absorbs seed, and most people planted carelessly. The Kybalion hinted at this through the principle of mentalism. The all is mind. Reality, according to Hermetic philosophy, was filtered continuously through consciousness. Human beings did not merely observe the world neutrally. They interpreted it through accumulated mental patterns built over years of repetition. Invisible structures created visible experience. Modern psychology would later echo similar truths. Repeated thoughts strengthen neurological pathways. Emotional associations reinforce behavioral patterns. Belief shapes expectation. Expectation influences action. Action produces consequence. Consequence then reinforces belief again. The cycle deepens quietly. Imagine walking through a forest repeatedly along the same path. Over time, the ground hardens beneath your feet. The route becomes easier to travel because repetition carves familiarity into the landscape itself. Thought patterns function similarly inside consciousness. Repeated mental reactions create deeply worn internal pathways. Eventually, the mind follows them automatically. This explains why some people remain trapped inside the same emotional realities for decades. The external details may change, but the internal structure remains identical. Someone repeatedly rehearsing fear eventually interprets life through fear. Someone constantly anticipating rejection unconsciously behaves defensively, often creating the very outcomes they fear most. Thought influences behavior invisibly, and behavior shapes reality visibly. The ancients understood this deeply enough to treat imagination itself as sacred. Egyptian initiates practiced visualization rituals carefully. Greek philosophers emphasized disciplined contemplation. Hermetic teachings warned against uncontrolled mental imagery because repeated internal pictures gradually influenced emotional atmosphere and action. The subconscious does not remain neutral, it absorbs. A person who constantly imagines humiliation begins carrying tension unconsciously into conversations. Someone repeatedly rehearsing resentment gradually reshapes their personality around bitterness. Another, who cultivates thoughts of possibility and resilience, behaves differently long before external evidence fully appears. Inner architecture changes outer movement. This is why destructive thought loops become so dangerous. Most people assume thoughts disappear harmlessly once they pass through the mind. But the ancients believed repeated thoughts accumulate energetic force over time. What consciousness rehearses repeatedly becomes increasingly believable, increasingly automatic, increasingly real psychologically. Eventually, identity forms around repetition. This process rarely feels dramatic. It unfolds slowly through ordinary moments, tiny reactions, passing assumptions, quiet internal sentences repeated thousands of times across years. I'm unlucky, I always fail, people cannot be trusted, nothing changes. These phrases appear insignificant individually, yet repetition transforms them into invisible laws governing perception itself. And once identity forms around a belief, consciousness begins defending it unconsciously. That is why transformation often feels uncomfortable initially. Interrupting old thought patterns challenges familiar identity structures built over years of repetition. The subconscious resists unfamiliar mental territory even when old patterns create suffering. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown possibility. Ancient initiates recognized this resistance clearly. They believed awakening required observing thought itself, rather than unconsciously obeying every mental pattern automatically. Awareness interrupted conditioning. Conscious observation weakened repetitive loops gradually. The observer inside the mind became stronger than the habit. This is where true mental discipline begins, not by pretending negative thoughts never appear, but by refusing to feed them endlessly through unconscious repetition. A fearful thought may arise naturally. The danger begins when consciousness rehearses it repeatedly until imagination strengthens it into emotional certainty. Attention amplifies thought, and amplified thought shapes perception. The Stoics practiced this constantly. Marcus Aurelius examined his thoughts deliberately because he understood interpretation created unnecessary suffering. Epictetus warned students not to accept every mental impression as truth automatically. Hermetic initiates approached the mind similarly, with vigilance, because consciousness is always building something. The terrifying reality is that most people construct inner prisons without realizing it. Their repeated thoughts become walls limiting action, confidence, creativity, and perception itself. Then they mistake those invisible structures for objective reality. But awareness changes everything. The moment you begin observing repetitive thought patterns consciously, distance appears between identity and conditioning. You realize thoughts are influences, not absolute truth. The internal architect becomes visible, and visible patterns can be rebuilt. So begin with one simple practice. Interrupt destructive thought loops the moment you notice repetition beginning. Not through force or denial, but through awareness. Observe the sentence. Notice the emotional atmosphere attached to it. Then deliberately redirect attention before repetition deepens the pathway further. Because according to ancient Hermetic wisdom, every repeated thought quietly shapes the architecture of your future reality, one mental brick at a time. Chapter 13. Raising your vibration through attention. There is an old teaching from Hermetic circles that most people misunderstand completely. Attention is not passive awareness. It is active energy investment. Where attention goes, life begins to reorganize itself. A wandering merchant in ancient Alexandria once noticed something strange about his own fortunes. On days when his mind was scattered, thinking about debts, fears, and competing desires, his decisions became clumsy. He missed opportunities standing directly in front of him. Deals collapsed. Conversations turned tense. But on days when his attention was steady, focused, almost quiet inside, everything seemed to align differently. People responded more clearly. Timing improved. Choices felt sharper. Nothing external had changed. Only attention had. The Hermetic initiates would have called this a shift in vibration. Not in a mystical sense of fantasy, but in the very real sense that focused consciousness organizes perception differently. The Kybalion teaches that mind is not just a receiver of reality, it is a transmitter of influence. And attention is the mechanism through which that transmission becomes structured. When attention scatters, energy scatters. When attention concentrates, energy coheres. Modern life has created an invisible crisis around this principle. The human mind is pulled in dozens of directions every minute. Notifications, images, conversations, fears, comparisons, endless fragments of stimulation. Each fragment takes a portion of attention, and each portion weakens the overall field of focus. Ancient initiates trained for years to protect attention, not because they feared distraction, but because they understood a deeper law. Fragmented attention produces fragmented perception, and fragmented perception produces unstable life experience. A mind that cannot hold itself steady cannot direct itself clearly. Imagine trying to light a fire while shaking your hands constantly. The flame flickers, struggles, and eventually dies. But steady hands allow the fire to grow. Attention works the same way. It is the stabilizing force behind intention, perception, and action. This is why meditation traditions across cultures treated concentration as sacred discipline. In Taoist mountains, monks trained their awareness not as escape from life, but as refinement of it. In Hermetic temples, students were taught to hold single-pointed focus for long periods before being introduced to deeper teachings. Even Stoic philosophy emphasized disciplined attention to the present moment as the foundation of mental strength, because attention determines what becomes real to the mind, not in the external world immediately, but in how the world is experienced, interpreted, and responded to. When attention is constantly fractured, emotional states become unstable. Fear arises more easily. Anxiety grows without clear cause. Decisions become reactive instead of intentional. The mind begins to feel like it is being pulled by invisible forces, when in reality it is simply being scattered by uncontrolled focus. Ancient teachers described this as energetic leakage. Every unnecessary shift of attention drains internal coherence. Every impulsive reaction weakens concentration. Every distraction breaks the continuity of awareness needed for clarity to form, and without clarity, even opportunity becomes invisible. There is a subtle truth hidden here. What most people call lack of opportunity is often actually lack of sustained attention long enough to recognize opportunity. A farmer who keeps looking at the sky, the ground, the horizon, and his fears simultaneously will miss the signs of weather changes he could have used to his advantage. But a farmer who observes carefully notices patterns others overlook. Attention reveals what scattered minds cannot perceive. The same applies to modern life. Focus does not create reality externally, but it determines what reality you are capable of engaging with internally. The Hermetic initiates believed that consciousness tuned itself like a lens. A blurry lens distorts everything it sees. A focused lens reveals detail, structure, and meaning that were always present but previously unnoticed. So raising vibration in this context is not about chasing emotional highs. It is about refining attention until consciousness becomes steady enough to perceive clearly and act deliberately. That is why ancient training was rigorous. Students were sometimes asked to sit in silence and observe a single object or thought without drifting, not to suppress the mind, but to strengthen its ability to remain present without fragmentation. Because presence is power, when attention is unified, emotional states stabilize naturally, reaction time improves, awareness deepens, even intuition becomes clearer, not because something external is speaking louder, but because internal noise has decreased. This is also where manifestation teachings become misunderstood in modern times. Many assume raising vibration means forcing positive emotion, but ancient Hermetic understanding suggests something more grounded. Sustained, coherent attention naturally elevates emotional state by reducing internal contradiction. Focus creates alignment. Distraction creates fragmentation, and fragmentation lowers energetic coherence. So the practical action is simple but demanding. Protect your attention aggressively. Notice what fragments it. Notice what drains it. Notice how often your awareness is pulled away from what truly matters. Then begin returning it deliberately, not once, not twice, but repeatedly until concentration becomes a natural state again. Because according to ancient initiates, attention is not just mental activity. It is the foundation through which consciousness organizes experience. And what you consistently attend to begins to shape the vibration of your entire inner world. Chapter 14. The Return to Hermetic Power. There is an old Hermetic idea that sounds almost like a forgotten warning whispered across centuries. Humanity did not lose its power. It forgot it, not suddenly, not in a single collapse, but gradually, through distraction, survival pressure, and constant external noise, consciousness shifted from creating reality through awareness to merely reacting to reality as if it were fixed. Ancient initiates would have described this as a reversal of direction. Instead of consciousness shaping experience, experience began shaping consciousness. But the original teaching of Hermeticism never accepted this as permanent. In the Corpus Hermeticum, the divine mind is described as a living intelligence in which human awareness participates continuously, not separate from reality, but embedded within it like a wave within the ocean. The wave appears distinct, but it is never truly separate from the water that forms it. So too with human consciousness. It does not stand outside existence observing passively. It participates. The Hermetic initiates called this alignment with divine mind, an inner condition where thought, perception, and intention no longer scatter randomly, but begin to synchronize with deeper patterns of order already present in existence. This is not fantasy thinking, it is disciplined awareness. A man in an ancient Greek legend once sought guidance from a temple oracle during a period of collapse in his life. He expected to receive external instructions, something spoken from beyond himself that would fix his situation. Instead, the priest simply asked him to sit in silence for several days without distraction, observing his own thoughts without judgment. At first, he resisted. He wanted answers, not observation, but over time something shifted. He began to see how his internal reactions were producing confusion, fear, and contradiction. His outer life was unstable because his inner world was unstable first. The temple did not give him new reality. It revealed the structure of his existing consciousness. That was the teaching. Internal mastery precedes external influence. This principle appears across Hermetic, Stoic, and even early psychological traditions. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly that a man's life is shaped not by events, but by the meaning he assigns to them. Epictetus taught that disturbance comes from judgment, not circumstance. Hermetic teachings expanded this further. Consciousness itself organizes perception, and perception determines lived reality. So when internal order collapses, external life appears chaotic, not because the world changed, but because interpretation became unstable. Modern life constantly pulls awareness outward toward reaction, comparison, urgency, and emotional stimulation. This weakens the capacity for deliberate inner governance. People respond to life instead of shaping their response to it. They move through days without noticing how frequently unconscious thoughts are steering perception. But hermetic power begins precisely here. Governing thought deliberately, not suppressing it, not forcing positivity, but observing it as an active creative force, shaping emotional atmosphere continuously, because every thought carries a subtle tone, a frequency, a direction. Left unattended, thoughts cluster into emotional climates, states of tension, hope, anxiety, confidence, doubt. These climates become the invisible environment in which decisions are made, and decisions shape destiny more than isolated thoughts ever could. The initiates understood this deeply. They trained themselves to notice internal movement before it became unconscious momentum. A thought of fear was not judged, it was observed. A thought of doubt was not obeyed, it was interrupted. A thought of clarity was reinforced deliberately until it became dominant. Over time, this created inner coherence, and coherence changes how reality is experienced, because when consciousness becomes less fragmented, perception becomes more stable, opportunities become clearer, reactions become slower, emotional volatility decreases, not because life becomes easier, but because interpretation becomes more aligned. This is what ancient texts meant by returning to power. Not controlling external events, but restoring authority over internal direction. A fragmented mind is pulled in every direction by circumstance. A governed mind chooses its interpretation before reacting. That choice is the beginning of influence, not over others, but over one's own lived reality. And once internal mastery stabilizes, external influence follows naturally. Not through manipulation, but through clarity. People trust coherence. Situations respond differently to stable awareness than to emotional chaos. So the return to hermetic power is not mystical escape, it is disciplined responsibility. To become aware of thought before it becomes identity, to notice perception before it becomes reaction, to govern consciousness before it becomes circumstance, and in doing so, to re-enter alignment with what the ancients called divine mind, the underlying intelligence of order that becomes visible only when inner noise quiets enough to perceive it. Because according to Hermetic wisdom, power was never lost, it was simply buried under unconscious thought.